A very good evening and welcome you all to the closing ceremony of International Research Conference on Mindfulness IRCM 2022 at Indian Institute of Management, Bodh Gaya. Hope all of you had a great session yesterday and received useful feedback regarding your research work. Success is less about what you get at the end, but more about who you become in the journey. IRCM 2022 is an initiative, a journey undertaken by IIM Bodh Gaya to start a conversation around how we can achieve a better understanding of mindfulness and apply it in different spheres of life. And we would like to believe that today, when we walk out of this conference gathering, we understand ourselves a little better and also can extend the same to others. The initiative would not have been materialized if we do not have a visionary leading us. Dr. Vinita Sahai, the director, IIM Bodh Gaya, was there starting from reviewing the papers, guiding us throughout the process and extending all possible support. Thank you, ma'am. Here, I would like to request the director, ma'am, to address the gathering and share her insight from the conference.
Thank you, Nanda. So, good evening to all the participants, delegates, my conference chairs, my faculty colleagues, students, and 3 more visionary mindful practitioners, coach, trainers, all in one that we're going to hear today. It has indeed been a pleasure, so much of a learning for last 2 days for each one of us, where in our own understanding, in our own limited understanding more as individuals, we had some clue as to what mindfulness is all about. But those hundreds of papers which have come to us and all these speakers who've been there with us, they've actually taken it from very individual level to more at an organizational level and at a very collective level. So this journey would have taken us much longer if this conference would not have happened. So we're very, very thankful even to this gathering of like-minded people collectively discussing this whole concept of mindfulness. So huge learning for us, for our team, and the collective knowledge creators. As I had already said yesterday, that yes, this wealth belongs to the region, this wealth belongs to the country, but only thing is we have to get more little scientific, empirical evidences around it. We have to see that it reaches every corner of the nation, every corner of the globe, so that whatever has been ours, whatever we truly were custodian of, we can actually be instrumental in spreading it for the larger benefit of the humanity. So with this, I really congratulate the organizing team and all the experts who have taken out their time and have contributed in this collective journey of knowledge building. And I hope that we would continue this IRCM every year, if not every year, every alternate year, because as we have already decided that mindfulness is a core value as an institution that we would continue to not just practice, but also create knowledge around it. So this IRCM would have a very major role in this journey. And as I said, this is just the first one and the maiden one, and we would have many, many more such journeys, if I can say. Because even sitting through all these papers, like yesterday I was attending some of the papers around more as a marketing professor, there was so much that I could learn about mindful consumption, or mindful marketing rather. We realized that how so many times that we're not particularly conscious of the choices that we're making, mindful of the products that we're choosing, because all said and done, this is going to have a huge lingering impact on not just the environment, but humanity large. So at every discipline, at every area, this would have huge implications and applications, and together as an academic fraternity, we have to generate enough knowledge around it so that we can celebrate and we can share it with the larger world. So once again, thank you to all the contributors, more in terms of research papers, because as I said, the whole journey is all about knowledge creation. And I hope you will not just we'll be able to publish some books around it and more special editions around the journals around it, so that whatever that gets created within these 2-3 days of discussion gets to the larger audience. So thank you to the team, and I hope I'll see not just these many people, but many more breed of investigators, if I can say, researchers, if I can use the word, who would be delving deeper into this realm of beautiful concepts like attention, mindfulness, the realms which appear to be very enigmatic, but yes, we can together unravel it and make it useful to every member of the society. Thank you so much to the team, and I hope with the same gusto you will carry IRCM round 2. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. We hope we'll be continue to enrich ourselves in the upcoming sessions, editions of IRCM in future, and able to extend the learning again and again. Today we have assembled here to listen to our distinguished guest of the evening. Our first guest of the day is Professor Amit Bernstein. Professor Amit is a professor of psychology, director of the Observing Mind Lab at the University of Haifa, and member of the Israel Young Academy. Amit is interested in how well-being and suffering are impacted by the ways in which we process, experience, and respond to our internal states, and thereby how mindfulness and mental training may be used therapeutically. His team is currently studying the nature and the function of attention in mental health, the salutary and curative properties and mechanism of mindfulness, and the therapeutic translation of this work to care for vulnerable refugee population. In his most important and rewarding job, he is Jonathan's, Noga's, and Mia's father. We are honored to have him here today. Over to Professor Amit.
Unmute myself, so it's really an honor to be here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Professor, we can hear you.
All right, let me just open up the talk for you. Can you see a title slide clearly now?
Yes.
Yeah, all right. So it's really an honor to be here. Really appreciate the invitation. It's really quite cool to be connecting from so far apart with you all in India. I'm really heartened to see so many of you here, and hoping some of you will really be interested in this work. And what I'll talk about today is how we can collectively work to restore the human rights and the mental health of forcibly displaced people who are seeking sanctuary. So all of us together are living in the midst of a global human rights crisis right now. Today, there are more than 82 million people who are forcibly displaced from their homes due to conflict, persecution, and also increasingly natural disaster. Now, due to the trauma and the loss and stress of forced displacement, this global human rights crisis has led to a global mental health crisis. Worse yet, we're likely actually all together here only at the very initial stages of this crisis. Due to climate change and conflict, it's projected, has been projected that anywhere between 200 million to as many as 1 billion people will be forcibly displaced by 2050. It's only less than 30 years from now. Very, very disturbing projections. Now, on the one hand, I think it's very clear that this crisis is very, very global. It's even so global, it's hard to wrap our head around what does it mean that there are 80-some million people who are forcibly displaced from their homes and their lives. But I think one way of understanding this is also understanding that this crisis isn't only global, it's actually it's also very, very local. And the crisis itself is unfolding in communities all over the world, beginning in many, many places, in Damascus and Tripoli and Afghanistan and Myanmar, Somalia, and many other origin countries. And it's reaching all over the world. Athens and Berlin and Paris and Istanbul and Rome and Delhi and Tel Aviv here in the Middle East, in Israel, where I live. Now, to give you a sense of this, beginning in around 2006, forcibly displaced children and adults from Eritrea and Sudan began to seek refuge in Israel. And to introduce you to this work and this phenomena, there's kind of a lot of ways to do that. And one way that I think is important, it's hard, but it's important, is just for a few moments, I want us together to try to just even begin to understand, to come into contact with the lived experience of forced displacement of this people and of this community. So one way to do that is I want to share a short clip from a really very well-made documentary by a brilliant filmmaker named Karen Shayo about Eritrean asylum seekers. It's 2 minutes long. If you don't want to be exposed, it's very hard emotionally. If you want to step away or turn down your mic for 2 minutes, it's fine. It's a little under 2 minutes. But do brace yourself. It's hard to watch and it's a very painful experience to try to touch, but I think it's very important to do. All right.
Hello? Hello? يا ربي بالجغني رعبتي.
Dear listeners, this is Meron Stefanos broadcasting from Stockholm, Sweden, Voices of Eritrean Refugees. The goal is like, I want to end this. Like, you hit a dog in Sweden, you go to jail for 6 months. You know? And here I listen to people being tortured every hour. And the whole world is watching, doing nothing, you know, it's just...
قسم قصة رأينا بحس أكو فينا نعلم كأب يعني أنت مو على إسرائيل راح لنا قبلكم بدل.
كم دقيقة في الكا؟ 3 شيء 25,000.
They were melting plastic bags and dropping it in their bags. And this is the burns.
تاريخ العالم ترى زي في الكعب عندنا بلغم أساسا إرتراوي بخلطة بون خرال تحرك كم دي بهلنا كم دي بيخونتاتنا نابي يكون كتكلم نابي
بشا زودي يا مرارم شاب زي خدكم يا تشلا يا مدانا شما شاب شما.
So I think it's very clear that it's really important that we ask ourselves here and all over the world, what can be done to resist and to begin to correct injustice of this scale and magnitude and urgency? And what can we do to help heal suffering of this scale? Now, despite the magnitude and the urgency and also the projected growth of this human rights and mental health crisis, our scientific knowledge and evidence-based capacity to help care for forcibly displaced people is many years behind the challenge. And we asked ourselves, as part of these global efforts, what can we do as a research group? And what can be our part in these many, many large global efforts? And two I guess, central values or beliefs have really motivated and guided our work over the past decade. First, I also believe that mental health and the right to recovery following forced displacement is a human right, and that it's essential to achieve social justice, social equality. And we believe also, and no less importantly, that it is our ethical obligation to bring the most rigorous and the most compassionate science available to try to empower and to care for forcibly displaced people in need. So we moved our laboratory from our lovely green campus in Haifa. This is our campus atop the Carmel Mountains and overlooking the Mediterranean, you can see in the horizon. And we built a very modest, small, mobile, kind of like an ambulatory laboratory in the urban heart of the African asylum seeker community in South Tel Aviv. And this initial work was led by Kim Yuval, a passionate human rights activist and one of my first PhD students. He has finished his PhD a couple of years ago now. We still work together, fortunately. And together, we set 3 goals. First, we hoped to ally with asylum seekers so we could better understand their mental health needs. Second, we hoped to translate what we learned, these insights that we hoped to gain, into a novel intervention program or programs to begin to care for asylum seekers, first in our community. And then we hoped that if we were really, really successful, then maybe we and others could adopt and later adapt this intervention to empower and help support forcibly displaced people around the world in other communities. And so we started our work. And over several years, we conducted a number of studies among African asylum seekers in Israel. We carried out studies in the central bus station in South Tel Aviv. We worked out of a tent outside of a detention center for asylum seekers in the desert, in the middle of the desert, actually. We worked inside an NGO, Physicians for Human Rights, with torture survivors. We carried out a study that was really cool with a really, really dynamic and powerful NGO called Kuchinate in South Tel Aviv that works with mostly Eritrean women and survivors of torture. And also we worked in UNITAF. It's a kindergarten with refugee parents and their children. And there's a lot I could share from these studies, but just sort of briefly to give you a sense, what did we learn that might be important? Well, we found overwhelming evidence of a mental health crisis among African asylum seekers here in our community, a crisis of suffering and despair. And to give you a sense of what that more operationally might mean is we found that African asylum seekers in Israel had suffered from extraordinarily high rates of traumatic stress experiences. These include torture and imprisonment, being close to death, combat, and being separated from their family, on and on. And like so many other asylum seekers and refugees, this population includes survivors of torture, human trafficking, and even among them child soldiers from East Africa. Second, following the trauma that led to and of their forced displacement, they struggled to cope with a wide range of chronic stressors, like so many other forcibly displaced people around the world. These include fear of deportation and conflict with immigration officials, and grief and separation, and loneliness and isolation, and a lack of access to education and vocational opportunities, and even sadly, discrimination and xenophobia, and on and on. And third, despite an unambiguous strength and resilience, and a real kind of a driving will to survive and to thrive as a community, they also suffer at extremely high rates from invisible scars of their forced displacement. So across multiple studies and samples of many hundreds of refugees and asylum seekers, we have found that as many as 55 to 80% in the community, not in clinics, not treatment seekers, but in community samples, are struggling with severe mental health problems, including PTSD, post-traumatic stress, depression, and anxiety. It is a real mental health crisis without hyperbole. Likewise, you can see that, to give you a sense of this, and sort of a sense of the degree of the distress and despair that's involved with this kind of lived experience, you can see that rates of suicidal ideation are also strikingly elevated in this community. And you can see particularly how they are elevated in asylum seekers who are struggling with other mental health problems. It was really at this point in our kind of research journey, I guess, that we understood that we must try to do more than good observational science, that we needed to take action through our work if we could. And through our initial years of study and work with this community and with the NGOs that serve them on the ground, we came to understand something that I believe to this day, I think it's very important. In hindsight, maybe it was obvious, but we didn't understand it at the time. We came to understand that the sanctuary that forcibly displaced people seek entails more than the objective safety of a physical place to survive post-migration. And at the time, we theorized that to heal and to recover, and ultimately maybe even thrive and flourish post-displacement, that sanctuary must also be characterized by a subjective or a felt sense of safety in one's body and in one's mind, in one's lived experience. It's more than a place to be safe. And so, in close partnership with members of the refugee community and clinicians and researchers all around the world, we set out to try to develop a novel intervention to help forcibly displaced people cultivate this subjective sanctuary, this felt sense of safety in their lived experience in their bodies and minds, despite the often uncontrollable and typically painful ongoing realities of their lives post-displacement. And over time, we came to understand and we theorized that mindfulness and compassion-based training may be surprisingly very well suited to help diverse forcibly displaced people learn to cultivate, to create moments of refuge and moments of safety within their minds and bodies. And we hoped thereby, through cultivating those moments of refuge in their own lived experience, to enable the beginning of a longer term process of healing and recovery. Now, it might seem a bit nuts. I talked to different audiences in the world, and even to me to this day, yeah, it might seem a bit nuts to some of you to try to teach asylum seekers from East Africa to meditate. And it is a little bit nuts on the one hand, but nevertheless, there were also a number of reasons to think that mindfulness-based interventions may be uniquely powerful and actually quite well suited for these populations and the unique contexts, the settings in which they reside post-displacement. Very briefly, in multiple studies, we found that mindfulness consistently predicted resilience and recovery among African asylum seekers. And this was really despite my skepticism. This effect just replicated across multiple samples. Second, there is a growing, really now it's quite a robust set of studies that have documented evidence of psychological and biological stress buffering effects of mindfulness training and improved mental health outcomes that are linked to processes like allostatic load and trauma. Third, mindfulness training targets, in part, some processes that can be conceptualized or understood as universal processes. These are processes that, to some degree, transcend language and they transcend culture, such as attention, awareness, compassion. Fourth, mindfulness training is delivered in groups. It can low cost. It's been implemented in diverse contexts and populations. It can also be implemented through emerging digital internet-supported types of platforms. In these ways, we hope that mindfulness training might prove to be a feasible and scalable intervention, even in complex post-displacement settings. And so we developed mindfulness-based trauma recovery for refugees, or something we sometimes call MBTR, mindfulness-based trauma recovery for refugees. And this intervention program is a mindfulness and compassion-based intervention that is trauma sensitive and socio-culturally adapted for diverse, forcibly displaced people. And we hoped that the intervention would first help asylum seekers experience moments of refuge and moments of safety in their own body and in their mind. And in doing so, we hoped that the intervention would help traumatized refugees begin the longer-term process of recovery and healing. Now, I'll be pretty brief here, but the intervention involves 9 2.5-hour group sessions and also quite intensive home practice. And the home practice is done through a YouTube channel with guided meditation practices. And the intervention includes all sorts of elements, psychoeducation focused on the effect of stress and trauma, and quite a bit of mindfulness meditation based closely on established mindfulness-based intervention protocols, very secularized protocols, including mindfulness-based stress reduction or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, MBSR, MBCT type interventions. It also includes loving kindness practices to cultivate compassion and self-compassion. It also has quite a few trauma-sensitive adaptations to help ensure the safety of mindfulness practices for traumatized refugees, based on the work of people like David Treleaven and Willoughby Britton and others. We then deliver these practices in ways that are, this is very important for the acceptability and feasibility of this, in ways that are socio-culturally adapted for varied refugee populations. So for example, we involve a cultural mediator from the refugee community in all intervention group sessions. All the intervention materials are developed in close collaborations with members of the community. We conduct cognitive interviews to ensure clarity and meaning of all materials. We integrate sort of various kinds of culture-bound linguistic idioms to illustrate key principles and practice of the intervention, among many, many other kinds of a variety of other adaptations. Finally, the intervention is delivered within and also by members of the community. So for example, the intervention was delivered in a safe space in the heart of the refugee community. It's not, this work isn't carried out in a clinic or in a university. 50% of our team are refugees alongside Israeli students and staff. Members of the community provide childcare for group participants during the groups. And for example, during these interventions in this first clinical trial that I'll talk about, all the shared meals were prepared. There's a shared meal in the middle of the session, and all the shared meals were prepared by members of the asylum seeker community. And so today I'll talk about one study briefly about this was the first large randomized control trial, the first RCT that we conducted to test mindfulness-based trauma recovery in this population. And we set out to deliver the intervention and to test its feasibility, its efficacy, safety, and its mechanisms of action. And this first project was led by our very talented Anna Reeves. Her PhD work has focused on MBTR among asylum seekers. And she led this project with Kim Yuval, who I talked about earlier. And she actually submitted her PhD dissertation just a few days ago. And the team here recruited and randomized 158 Eritrean asylum seekers, women and men, to the intervention and waitlist control condition. And we conducted a wide range of assessments, various kinds of measurement modalities at 21 time points before, during, and following the intervention. And we then asked ourselves the same question that some of you may be asking yourself, which is, does it work? Yeah. Does it really make sense to try to teach African asylum seekers mindfulness and compassion practices? And how could doing so possibly help when the objective reality of their lives can be so grim and challenging? So first, did mindfulness and compassion training help refugees experience moments of refuge and safety? And there's a lot of ways of showing these kind of, I'll just give you one kind of heuristic illustration of this. You can see data here over the course of the 9 intervention sessions in the 9 weeks in daily living. And in gray bars are, I don't know if they're gray or black where you see them, they show levels of tranquility and calmness experienced each week in daily living outside of the sessions. And then bars in white show the weekly elevations in calmness and tranquility that they experienced during each training session. We also see kind of steady growth of these feelings of safety over the course of the intervention, these moments. Here too, we see very similar, actually stronger effects of the training on positive emotion, as well as a steady growth of these feelings of positive emotion like happiness and joy in daily living over time, over the course of the program. Next, it's important to ask, well, did mindfulness and compassion training help refugees begin to heal and recover beyond these kind of moments of refuge? And remarkably, it appears that the answer might be yes, at least in this first randomized trial. We know that randomized trials, the initial effects tend to be larger than those that are observed later. And so we're in the midst of running additional studies. But in the first trial, what we found is, although almost all of the asylum seekers in the waitlist control still had PTSD following the study, less than half of the participants who received mindfulness and compassion training still struggled with PTSD. And even among the 48% that still met diagnostic criteria for PTSD, the large majority actually demonstrated very significant reductions in severity of their symptoms. And likewise, these therapeutic effects were maintained at follow-up for most of the intervention responders, despite the fact that there was no intervention following. At the end of there was no ongoing care provided following the intervention. In addition to PTSD, mindfulness-based trauma recovery also led to significant therapeutic effects on depression and anxiety and multimorbidity, as well as greater subjective well-being. In fact, it impacted all of the outcomes we measured. There are no outcomes that aren't reported here. Likewise, these therapeutic effects were maintained at follow-up for most participants, and these effects were moderate to large in magnitude. It's also important to note that these observed therapeutic effects were not limited to any specific demographic of the population. So effects didn't depend on gender or age or level of education or trauma history severity or even post-migration living difficulties. And what that means is, although it doesn't work for everybody, the therapeutic effects do appear to be largely universal. It's very important for an intervention program of this kind in light of the diversity and the complexity of post-migration settings and populations. In a more recent paper, we found also that relative to waitlist control, the intervention may also prevent the onset or the incidence, new caseness of suicidal ideation, which is also very exciting. And I will say, though, just to give you a sense, that we also found some exciting evidence here that these preventive effects for suicidality were mediated by the effects of the intervention on PTSD, depression, and anxiety and multimorbidity. In other words, what that means is that successful early intervention for stress and trauma-related mental health may serve to prevent the onset of suicidality among traumatized asylum seekers. Now, it's exciting. I'm really excited about these findings. They're very promising, but they're very initial. The numbers are small, and they're post hoc analyses. Yeah, so they really require robust replication before we can get too excited about these particular findings on suicidality prevention. I also want to highlight that in contrast to these very encouraging preventive effects, MBTR did not reduce suicidal ideation among those that already presented suicidal ideation to begin with, even among those that benefited therapeutically. It's very unfortunate, but something that's been seen in multiple other mindfulness-based interventions in other populations. Next, we asked, is mindfulness and compassion training safe for refugees? Might it cause harm to some who are struggling with the greatest degree of trauma or chronic stress or symptom severity? And we found that there was only one participant who demonstrated possible harm, and he returned to his baseline levels by follow-up. And so, bottom line, it appears that the intervention is in fact safe for even the most vulnerable and traumatized refugees. And these are very surprising and very good news. Now, within these initial trial findings in place, we are working now to transition to the next, and we hope, larger and longer phase of this project. Now, to have broad impact, we need to scale up the project and to reach forcibly displaced people from multiple origin countries, socio-cultural groups, and language groups, and who are living in diverse post-displacement settings around the world. And so we launched the Moments of Refuge project. And this is a global, multi-site, multi-arm study of the effects of MBTR on the mental and physical health of forcibly displaced people, their families, their children, and their communities. And towards this goal this year, we will launch a second randomized control trial of MBTR. We also are planning a smart design trial of an internet-supported mobile health adaptation of MBTR that we developed during COVID called Mindfulness SOS. And we also plan to test the effects of the group and the mobile health interventions beyond individual mental health, based on some preliminary findings on physical health related to allostatic load, on intimate partner violence and family violence, parenting, and on child socio-emotional outcomes, among other pro-social outcomes within the refugee and host nation community. Now, if fundraising is successful, we hope very much to be able to launch this multi-site data collection in the next year. We're working on it hard, but it's been a challenge. Before I say goodbye in our last minute with you, there is one more message I'd like you to hear and one more person I'd like you to meet. His name is Mogus Tewelde Kidane. I think he illustrates the potential of this work very, very well.
Thank you, Professor Amit. This world of ours, yeah, he is requesting for video, I think, yeah.
Can you see? I'm not sure what you can see, but it appears to have. Nope. Can you see a video? I think you may have shared screen.
Professor Amit, we couldn't see the video if you're playing in case.
Okay, let me try again. I think maybe it was unshared. Let me try again.
So by the time Professor Amit get ready with this video, yeah, so it's here, I think.
Let's try again. If it doesn't work, it's no problem.
We refugees here were facing a lot of problems, especially with the deportation. It is the mind that gets me crazy, that gets me to depressed, because all the time thinking things. I'm addicted to it. I don't know how to stop it. When I stop it, I got peace. When I not know to stop it, I got crazy or I depressed. It's some like after you meditate, you become like new person. And then after so many hours, you get back where you have been. It's obvious, but for some more 4 minutes, you become someone very new. I hope so it will be distributed to all of the people and to become part of the refugee system. And it's like a medicine for me, maybe a luxury for you. It's like a medicine for me. It's a different way of interpretation for it. I use it for like a medicine.
So I just want to share, I'm really grateful to be part of a large team that has carried out this work. And I'm very grateful to organizations that have supported us in recent years. This kind of work just wouldn't be possible without this kind of funding and support. And I just want to thank you for listening and for your kindness and patience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Amit. This world of ours is a small and big at the same time. And everyone living here should live with a sense of safety, dignity, and happiness. So let's try at our end to be a little bit more mindful and allow that opportunity to everyone, the way they deserve to live. Thank you, everyone. Our next speaker of the evening is Dr. Susan Abedian. Dr. Susan is currently a Fulbright scholar and has been invited to go to Canada to help create curriculum on indigenous ways of knowing for the International Baccalaureate program. She earned a PhD in political economy and government from Harvard University, an MPA in international development from Harvard Kennedy School, and a MA in the anthropology of social change and development, also from Harvard University. Her early research on healing the effects of long-standing collective trauma and cultural damage, a key contributing factor in violence and impoverishment, was described by Nobel laureate in economics Professor Amartya Sen as pioneering and highly original. She now teaches, speaks, and consults internationally on leadership, managing change processes, and her ARIA principles of creating new realities. She builds on her earlier work at Cambridge Leadership Associate, facilitating the workshops and speaking on adaptive leadership. Between June 2017 to June 2019, Dr. Abedian served as a Franklin Fellow at the U.S. State Development's Office of International Religious Freedom, Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor. Her portfolio included preventing violent extremism, gender-based violence, rights of religious minorities in the Middle East and South Asia, and restoration of people and cultures following atrocities. She has also served as a fellow at MIT's Dalai Lama Center for Ethics and Transformative Values, as well as Harvard Center for Public Leadership. Welcome, Professor Susan.
Thank you for that warm welcome. It's such a pleasure to be here with you and a privilege to follow Amit's deeply meaningful presentation. He speaks of a topic that's very important and close to my heart, the healing of collective trauma. This is a topic I normally speak about, but today I'm going to talk about something really different, a different matter. Many of you attending this event are probably too young to remember the book Megatrends, authored by the preeminent social forecaster of our time, John Naisbitt, back in 1982. John recently passed away, April of last year. The term megatrend itself refers to any important shift or major movement in the progress of society. So John looked into the future and identified what he determined to be the upcoming major trends and shifts in our society. One of the megatrends he discussed in that original book was what he termed high tech, high touch. What he meant by high tech, high touch was that he saw that as time went by, human beings would need to balance technological incursions in our lives with a renewed focus on those things that make us human. In fact, John focused exclusively on one particular megatrend, this one particular megatrend in 1999 with a book by the same title. The book, High Tech, High Touch, examined the role technology plays in our accelerated search for meaning and human intimacy. The principal thesis was this: as our world becomes ever more immersed in technology, people would come to crave more of the human touch, what matters to us as humans, meaningful relationships, sensual experiences vis-a-vis not only the natural world, but also our inner world. So the megatrend John Naisbitt foretold beginning in the early 1980s was that our societies would become inundated with high tech. And remember, he wrote this at a time when the internet wasn't even a thing, but the writing was, of course, already on the wall. And indeed, we're now living in what he called the technologically intoxicated zone. This zone is a confusing and distracted state where we both fear and worship technology. Technology is potentially a magnificent tool that can increase productivity and liberate humans, but we can also easily lose our way in the technologically intoxicated zone through fear and addiction. And that's where high touch is critical. The trend to greater meaning and intimate connections with ourselves, others, and the natural world around us. So again, John foretold that as our lives become more technologically saturated, high tech would ignite a drive towards seeking high touch, what gives us meaning and purpose, a connection to the heart, and what some may experience as spirituality. And this is where the growing trend towards mindfulness practices fits in, I believe. The growing integration of mindfulness and other consciousness tools into our otherwise technologically saturated societies and sectors, including business. So yes, high tech, high touch, and here I would add another phrase, high mind. Allow me to explain. I've sometimes thought the term mindfulness could be a bit misleading. What is the mind we are seeking to be full of, in the fullness of? Mindfulness. To clarify the confusion, one could perhaps make a distinction between two kinds of minds, the physical mind and the higher mind. So when we speak of mindfulness, we're clearly not speaking about the mind we habitually navigate the physical world with. Mindfulness doesn't refer to dwelling more fully in the habitual mind, the physical mind. Rather, mindfulness is about dwelling in what I'm terming here the higher mind, expanded mind, the higher consciousness, the realm of awareness, presence, the here and now, void of the future or past. It's been called many names and wonderful descriptors. Now, by referring to this as higher mind, I'm not using higher in a hierarchical sense, but because literally in that state of being, the higher mind views things from a higher vantage point. It's the difference between seeing things from the perspective of being in the valley or from that of standing on the hilltop with a view of the valleys and all surrounding valleys. We have access to a part of us not limited to physicality. The traditional image of the lotus is apt here. Our physical mind rooted in the muck and mire of everyday life underwater, but the bloom reaches for the light, bursts forth in beauty towards the sun. It's one depiction of the higher mind. The muck and mire of life is rich with dense nutrients, as is the waters of emotion. So this is not to say that the physical mind, which roots us here and allows us to navigate physicality, is somehow inferior to the higher mind. But just to point out that higher mind has a rather different perspective on things, and incidentally, a different job or function. More on this later. So in sum, the megatrend I'm focused on today is of technologically inundated people, sectors, and societies seeking balance by reaching for and integrating practices that allow us, in a sense, to remain human despite all the technology. We do this by having a more intimate connection with ourselves, each other, and our inner and outer world. I suggest, therefore, that mindfulness and other practices like contemplation, meditation, that allow us to access the higher mind are a natural outcome of this quest for balance, what John Naisbitt described as the mega trend towards high tech, high touch. Let me just say a little about the characteristics of higher mind and states of mindfulness, though no doubt during this conference, you've already heard from those much more qualified to speak on the subject. One of the hallmarks of mindfulness is to inhabit the present moment, and by doing so, to develop the capacity to interrupt and step out of the physical mind. The physical mind characteristically ruminates about the past and then has the tendency to project fears and concerns of the past as future scenarios. Rumination and projection filters out experience of reality in the moment, and we become blind to inspired possibilities and potentialities. In other words, when we are caught in past preconceptions and projections, we can't have an authentic experience of what's true and possible in this now, this moment. Mindfulness, as many of you already know, is deeply connected to breath, slowing down, and being fully present in our body, in the central experience of the present moment. Walking, eating, sitting, washing dishes, whatever is before us. It's not about trying to escape the world by hovering above it, it's just dissociating. It's in fact a paradoxical act of anchoring to fly. To the extent that you can free yourself from the illusion of your physical mind and instead anchor your attention in the physicality of the present moment, this anchoring into the body, into the breath, into the everyday acts as a portal that enables your mind to expand and to fly to higher mind. Now, how can mindfulness as an act of anchoring to fly be strategic from a business perspective? This is not the subject of my talk, but I'll just offer a thought or two today. We, of course, know the stress relieving and health benefits of mindfulness for employees and therefore for productivity. But also, given today's challenges requiring companies to adapt quickly to a changing world, to transform themselves, to think out of the box, there's a strategic advantage to creating the new from the higher mind. There is a strategic advantage to creating from the present moment. From the vantage point of the present moment, freed from the shackles of a past projected as the inexorable future, horizons and possibilities open up. Abiding in awareness, in presence, in the higher mind, in mindfulness, people's attachment to rigid identities can also become loosened. It's the physical mind that generates unyielding identities and attachments to those identities. In business, in life, one sets goals to move from here to there. From the valley perspective, from the physical mind, getting from point A to B requires a kind of linear or logically produced map. However, from the hilltop, from the higher mind, the vision is broader, and the efficacious route is often non-linear, extra-logical. There's a greater need for and reliance on improvisation and in the moment decision-making guided by intuition, a route that to the physical mind may appear to not make a whole lot of business sense or to even be dangerous, may in fact turn out to be the most efficacious route to the intended goal. Incidentally, the history of trauma interferes with being present in the moment, with dwelling in higher mind. This is in part because traumatization can lock one's attention on traumatic past experiences. The traumatized mind fixates on traumatic images and projects those fearful images into the future. And by doing so, trauma perceptions tend to narrow one's lens and therefore also restrict creativity. One's reality is filtered and distorted by the trauma and the fearful limitations in thinking that traumatic experiences can generate. When in deep stress and survival mode, it takes training and discipline to learn to inhabit the higher mind. But this is exactly when one needs mindfulness and access to the higher mind the most, as Amit pointed out so beautifully. Higher mind is needed to find a way through the thicket. Now, let me now turn to the last portion of my short presentation, how aligning one's business with the megatrend of high tech, high touch, high mind may engender innovation and transformation in organizations. Now, I'm going to cite a 2019 study by InnoSight, a consultancy firm founded in 2000 by a Harvard Business School professor and his partner, and which advises enterprises on business strategy. This InnoSight study identifies 20 of the world's most transformative companies, which they refer to as Transformation 20. The T20 study identifies the global companies that have achieved the highest impact business transformations over the past decade, as measured by new growth, repositioning the core business, and financial performance. Each of these companies developed new growth businesses outside its traditional core, which then became a significant share of the overall business. What they found is that the common thread among the 20 most transformative companies was a strategic impulse to identify a higher purpose mission. In other words, the most successful transformative organizations made a strategic decision to infuse a higher purpose into their culture, one that gave clarity to everyday tasks, guided everyday decision-making, directed attention from any resistance to change, and instead toward creating the new and propelling these companies to success. Now, let me give you the example of one of my favorites of these transformative organizations. It was originally called the Danish Oil and Natural Gas Company, shortened to DONG, D-O-N-G, and then renamed Ørsted in 2017 after Danish physicist Hans Christian Ørsted, who discovered the principles of electromagnetism in 1820. Now, one of the reasons why DONG's makeover is compelling and relevant to our conversation is that their successful transformation was congruent with a number of different megatrends. One of the major trends is what I've already identified as high tech, high touch, high mind. The others I will mention only briefly because of our time constraints. For example, one other megatrend businesses needed to be cognizant of is, of course, climate change. And another is the business megatrend of the rapid rise of socially conscious citizens and consumers that are altering demand patterns. This in turn is connected to the megatrend of demographical changes, the different characteristics, say, between baby boomers, millennials, and Generation Z. Now, for clarification, baby boomers are those born after World War II, from 1946 to 64. They're followed by Generation X, the demographic cohort preceding the millennials. A millennial is anyone born between 1980 and 1995. And Generation Z is anyone born between 1996 and the early mid-2000s. Now, Gen Zers are the largest generation ever, comprising almost 30% of the world's population. Globally, there are almost 2 billion of them. And Gen Zers are known for being most socially focused and able to distinguish between businesses that support causes for the sake of improving their image and those that truly believe in a better future. So Greta Thunberg, the Swedish environmental activist, is an example of a Gen Zer. Why this is relevant is that the rapid rise in social consciousness is shaping and evolving the relationship between people and their most trusted brands, compelling marketers to generate social attributes around their brands. These companies that have found a way to align their brand with visions of a better world are already reaping the rewards. Patricia Aberdeen wrote a brilliant book entitled Megatrend 2010, The Rise of Conscious Capitalism, that details this explosive trend. She had co-authored several earlier books with John Naisbitt. In her Megatrends of 2010, Patricia describes how those companies placing social and environmental values ahead of the bottom line are actually boosting profits. I won't go into more detail about the various megatrends and their interactions in this short of a presentation, only to emphasize that businesses have to be aware of these trends in order to thrive in our radically changing context. And the transformation of the Danish oil and natural gas company, DONG, is an inspiring example of what's possible when organizations align with these megatrends. Let me just share a little bit about their story of transformation. In 2009, Denmark hosted the UN Climate Change Summit and seemed like the perfect venue to do so. This compact Scandinavian country had a reputation for green living, of cycling and recycling fanatics. But the army of foreign journalists at the UN event thought they had unearthed a dirty little secret. Denmark had one of the most carbon-intensive electricity generation systems in Europe and the world. And Dong Energy was the company largely responsible for the literal black cloud over Denmark. And it was controlled by the state. The irony was not lost on the journalists. The Danish government hosting the conference, a conference which had as its primary goal to lay out a plan to wean the world off fossil fuels, was itself dependent on and shackled to the grubby old world of oil, natural gas, and coal. At the time of the event in 2009, Dong emitted fully 1/3 of the country's carbon dioxide emissions. What the journalists didn't know, however, was that Dong was already beginning to launch a campaign to reinvent itself as a renewable energy company, with the vision of flipping itself from black to green energy production. This feat was to be accomplished in a generation, about 30 years. But in fact, they accomplished it in less than 10 years. This rapid transformation was remarkable for a number of reasons. The corporate overhaul was not easy by any stretch of the imagination. For one thing, the old guard within Dong fought to keep fossil fuels, especially coal, in the energy mix, and the company was essentially at war with itself. Fossil fuels were seen as their core competence, and where they could grow further. Managers and employees said, in effect, we're the best in the world in coal-fired power plants. We are the benchmark. Why would we ever change? There was broad and profound skepticism that a plan to turn green was even viable. And on a more emotional level, many felt the transformation threatened their sense of competence and identity, who they were and what they were good at doing. Now, who wants to feel incompetent and irrelevant? Now, those at the helm of Dong, who proposed that it become green, not only faced enormous resistance from within the organization, they also faced it from the Danish government itself. Politicians saw the transformation as way too risky. It was unthinkable that they could trade oil, gas, and coal for renewable energy. As Nelson Mandela said, it always seems impossible until it's done. It took a lot of courage and fortitude for those in senior positions of authority in the organization to do what they did. They exercised considerable leadership, aligned themselves with the megatrend, high tech, high touch, high mind, and locked their sights on a higher vision, one of a world run entirely by renewable energy. Despite early setbacks, they refused to retreat from their vision and indeed buckled down even more in their commitment to transformation. Dong emerged triumphant, in part by not being afraid to leave the past and forge a radically new identity marked by its bold renaming of itself to Ørsted. They practice a sort of organizational mindfulness, a steady dedication to their higher vision, the present moment and its challenges. An article about this tale of transformation reported that, quote, in 2009, Dong was largely a domestic Danish company. Today, Ørsted is the leader in offshore wind power with control of 30% of the global market, has more than 24 offshore farms in Denmark, Britain, Germany, Netherlands, and Taiwan, and has several in development off the US East Coast. By 2025, the company says it will generate enough green energy to supply 30 million people, up from 12 million today. The profitable transformation has propelled the company's stock market value of about US $30 billion, making it one of Europe's most valuable energy companies, unquote. There's so much more to say about this remarkable story, and I encourage you to learn more. There's an entire website dedicated to sharing Ørsted's story. What they and other top companies are demonstrating is that businesses are more capable of transforming and adapting to a changing world than we think. They can do this more easily when they align themselves with the new economy of consciousness, with the megatrend of high tech, high touch, and high mind. And kudos to the Mindfulness Center at the Indian Institute of Management, which in effect is designed to foster innovative business leaders of the future. I'll close by saying that, like the US and other countries, coal-reliant India will need to step up its game to meet its climate commitments. And Ørsted demonstrates what's possible, even if at first it seemed far-fetched and improbable. In the last century, India had already demonstrated that it could do this, achieve what once seemed impossible, inconceivable. Gandhiji set an example for the world in attaining political sovereignty. Now, India can do this unimaginable again and set another example, this time by gaining energy sovereignty and becoming green in less than a generation. This requires exercising leadership at all levels of society, civil, business, and government, and an emphasis on high tech, high touch, and high mind. Thank you. And I look forward to hearing any comments. And I believe we have a few minutes. I've kept a few minutes to answer any questions there might be. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Susan. It is really interesting. If you have any question, kindly go ahead and we can allow 1 or 2 questions for Dr. Susan.
Thank you so much, Susan. We really appreciate the support that we always receive from you. And let me assure on behalf of my institution that, like the same Danish company who actually became aware and made it all green, we are setting up a new campus and we have decided to keep it all green right from day one, which is the first initiative that we have thought. And secondly, even in a business school, we had choice to get into all kinds of, verticals or specializations, or, we could have embraced anything which is the buzzword of the current requirement, but we very mindfully chose the mindfulness, which is in a way being mindful about what is going to be the requirements from a business leader going forward. And that has already started showing results that almost in all domains, be it marketing, finance, more and more CEOs are looking for managers who are mindful. So these are small, humble ways in which we are trying to contribute. And of course, we really appreciate that the kind of support which we have been getting from mentors like you. My 2 team members keep telling me that how at every stage you have been a huge support to us, and thank you so much for that.
And my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Just to repeat once again, high tech, high touch, high mind, high mindfulness. We have, I think, a couple of questions. We can take it now.
And someone I just want to point out, I think Sunita Gupta said, high tech, high touch, high mind, high impact. So yes, high impact, exactly. And I think there's another comment about someone who joined hands with Reliant. I need my glasses to read to move away from fossil fuels. So we're doing that already in India, aren't we? Very exciting. But I guess the point is that there's so much more we can do, and that mindfulness is part of the practice that helps us. In fact, I was really privileged to be in contact with one of the CEOs just these past couple of days, who was a CEO at Ørsted during this transformation, and he said that he practices mindfulness. So this is not part of the story usually shared, but I'm sure that if we really delved more deeply into the story and spoke to the CEOs and various actors, I can't imagine that they didn't practice some form of mindfulness. So it'd be very interesting to actually go and talk to them and do a project to learn more from them about how they did it.
Okay. So Professor Susan, there is one, I would say that it's more of a subjective question which has been put up in the chat box. So while appreciating that it was an inspirational and a narrative talk on business and economic transformations, could hydrogen can be the answer?
Can what be the answer?
Could hydrogen be the answer to the economic transformation? Yeah.
It could be. I mean, I'm not, my talk was saying that we need to think out of the box. There are many possibilities. What we have in terms of wind and solar, it may just be the tip of the iceberg. There might be many other possibilities that we haven't even considered yet. And creativity, the need to be more creative, to think outside the box. Mindfulness, higher mind is really important for that endeavor. So that's my larger point, but definitely hydrogen, other possibilities. I'm not technically versed to say, but there are many, many, many things we haven't even yet considered that are on the fringe.
So there's a lot to be explored so that we can come to that conclusion. Thank you so much, Professor. Over
Thank
to you, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Susan. It was really nice to have you here. So with that, we'll move forward. The last speaker of the day is Dr. Deborah Schussler. Dr. Deborah is a professor of education in the Educational Leadership Program at the Pennsylvania State University. She is also an affiliate at the Prevention Research Center and Rock Ethics Institute. She was a high school teacher she was high school English teacher for 5 years before becoming a teacher educator. Deborah's research interest includes exploring how prospective teachers acquire the necessary dispositions to meet the needs of all learners. Specifically, Deborah has examined the epistemological nature of dispositions and how teacher education fosters awareness of disposition to enhance prospective teachers' knowledge, skills, and moral sensibilities. Teachers who are reflective and mindful about their intended aims and how they achieve those aims in their practice are better prepared to nurture the academic and socio-emotional development for their learners. Therefore, Deborah's recent work has strategically focused on mindfulness-based programs designed to enhance teachers' social, emotional competencies and communication skill. So here for last few changes, we do not have Dr. Deborah live, but we have a recorded lecture with us, so kindly.
Good morning. It's great to be with you today virtually. I apologize I'm not able to be here live. If one thing COVID has taught us, I think it's the power of being flexible and being certain about uncertainty. So thank you for taking the time. I'm honored to be sharing this with you today, and I look forward to hearing any thoughts you may have about this presentation. Today, I'm going to be talking about mindfulness-based interventions, especially how we go about researching them, including some challenges and some possibilities in how this field can move forward. So a quick overview, what I'll cover in the next 25 to 30 minutes is a very brief introduction to why we even are interested in mindfulness in so many sectors of our lives right now, especially as it has moved into the West. What some of these challenges are in terms of conducting our research and understanding why we're using mindfulness and to what end, and then to open up some possibilities in thinking about mindfulness and what we can do with it. So without further ado, why mindfulness? I turn to His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, who offered over 20 years ago in a lovely volume, Ethics for the New Millennium, a quote: "It's in everybody's interest to do what leads to happiness and avoid that which leads to suffering." And mindfulness is one means of achieving that. But it didn't end there. He goes on to say, because our interests are inextricably linked, we are compelled to accept ethics as the indispensable interface between my desire to be happy and yours. In other words, mindfulness is not just about my own personal journey, but it's about how my journey intertwines with your journey and how we have a responsibility to each other in our mutual journeys, wherever they take us. So as many of you know, there's been an insurgence of interest in mindfulness in the West. This has been in popular media. We've seen it infiltrating businesses. One of our beloved anchors of a news program, 60 Minutes, Anderson Cooper, has hooked himself up to an fMRI, or others have hooked him up to an fMRI. We see children in schools using mindfulness. We see mindfulness being talked about in all different forms, yoga, walking, eating mindfully, even doing mindfulness assessment. It's everywhere. And friends, the research has followed. So just in the last 21 years, starting with the year 2000, the number of peer-reviewed articles in PubMed has increased dramatically. 155 peer-reviewed articles in the year 2000 to now, as of December of 2021, 3,315. That is a huge increase. So there's been a lot of growth, but that growth has come with some growing pains, and there are some challenges attached to that. So what I'd like to talk to you about today are grouping together kind of 4 broad challenges, especially in how we conduct our research around mindfulness. These have to do with our conceptualization of mindfulness, thinking through questions of ethics, looking at outcomes, and then thinking about aspects of implementation in our programs, especially how we facilitate and who facilitates these programs. So first, challenge 1, conceptualization. So how do we define mindfulness? Those of you who are visual learners may have seen and appreciate this graphic. It's one of my favorites. The adult who has a mind that is full versus a child who is being mindful. And these really speak to definitions that we've seen in the literature. So I'll start with a popular one from Jon Kabat-Zinn, which many of you have probably seen. He talks about mindfulness being about paying attention on purpose, non-judgmentally, and in the present moment. Much earlier, a few years later, Scott Bishop broke that down a little bit further, but you'll see some common elements. The definition that he and his colleagues at University of Toronto have offered is that mindfulness involves 2 main parts. First is the self-regulation of attention focused on immediate experience, allowing for recognition of present moment mental events. And the second part is the adopting of an orientation of curiosity, openness, and acceptance as one approaches those events. These are actually very much in line with what Bhikkhu Bodhi in 2011 goes back to some of the original Buddhist writings and describes the definition of mindfulness based on those writings. So mindfulness is when one dwells contemplating feelings in feelings, contemplating mind in mind, contemplating phenomena in phenomena, ardent, clearly comprehending, mindful, having removed covetousness and displeasure in regard to the world. This is called right mindfulness. So you'll see a lot of overlap here. It's about being in the present moment, how you're paying attention in that moment, and in this last definition, what you're paying attention to: feelings, thoughts, external phenomena, internal phenomena. So what's the problem? Why is conceptualization a problem? It's a problem when we have multiple conceptualizations and we don't have agreement on what those conceptualizations are. This is a problem because we have programs that are being developed, and it becomes very difficult to compare these programs to each other, especially when those developing them haven't been explicit about what their conceptualization is. We'll have more on that in a minute. This leads to some compounding problems. It becomes hard to compare programs across each other to see, well, how are we benefiting from mindfulness? Do these outcomes, can they be expected? when I use one program over a different program. We also see a conflation in conceptualization where desired outcomes are seen as the definition itself. They're not the same. And finally, it's unclear in some of these definitions, well, mindfulness to achieve what purpose? So thinking more clearly about conceptualization will help in all of these areas. And I think that leads us quite nicely into our second challenge, which is one of ethics. So why mindfulness? One of the things that's happened as mindfulness has become popularized in the West is there has been an emphasis on the self. People are concerned about themselves becoming more aware. They've been concerned about themselves, showing their own selves, self-care. They've become concerned with reducing their own stress, improving their own resilience and well-being. And there's nothing wrong with any of those things. The use of practices has also emphasized the self. We do mindful walking, usually on our own, a body scan on our own, breathing, often on our own. Again, that in and of itself is not a problem as long as it doesn't stop there. There are a lot of critics of this current popularization of mindfulness, even the coining of the term McMindfulness from our friend Purser. We also have some writers who have been critical of the emphasis on the self, becoming resilient, and ignoring potential systemic structures that create the need for such resilience. This equates to the goldfish being told to become resilient to toxic water, rather than looking at the system itself and changing the water so that it is clean. So mindfulness for what purpose is an ethical question. And I restate here the second part of the quote that I posted earlier from the Dalai Lama, because our interests are inextricably linked. We are compelled to accept ethics is the indispensable interface between my desire to be happy and yours. We must contend with the question of mindfulness for what purpose. And my hope is that where we land is not that it ends with the self. The self is the start, and the self is only part. The self must be contained within the whole. I don't think we have grappled with this question very well. In my own lab, just to give you a quick example, we have looked at how ethics are underpinning some of the school-based mindfulness curricula that have come out recently. And I'm only going to show you 3. So this is some preliminary analysis. We look to see what ethical frames were evident across the curriculum. So these percents are how many lessons, what percentage of the lessons in 3 different curricula, compassionate schools in green, C learning in blue, and mind up in yellow, adopt specific ethical frames, justice and fairness, the frame of rights, and the frame of compassion, empathy, and in some of the literature referred to as the welfare of others. And as you see, there are differences across. We also look to see what were the levels of commitment. Were they geared towards the self? Were they geared towards others? Were these immediate others, others in the community, or a global emphasis? And as you can see, again, some pretty stark differences. So now let's talk about our third challenge. And at first, this won't seem like a challenge at all, but bear with me. So we have the challenge of thinking about outcomes. There's a lot of research, as you saw in my line graph at the beginning of this presentation, that's been done on mindfulness-based interventions. We've seen improvements for adults in their physical health, aspects of their psychological well-being, depression, anxiety, reduced stress, improved resilience, improvements in self-regulation, even things that have to do with others, not just the self, improvement in their interpersonal relationships and their empathy and compassion, cognitive improvements, things like working memory and other executive functions. There are some lovely reviews on this literature, and I've listed a few for you. We've also seen with children and adolescents some similar positive outcomes. It's not across the board, not every study shows positive results, but many do, some more significant than others. And again, I've listed some reviews looking specifically at children and adolescents, especially with universal mindfulness-based interventions. So what's the problem? If we're seeing positive results, what's the problem? The problem is we don't know why we're getting those results. We have no theory of change. We don't know what the active ingredients are, or often called core components of these programs. In essence, the mindfulness practices that are happening are existing in a black box. We are unaware of the implementation elements that impact these outcomes. And if we're truly going to understand this, we really need to do an analysis, a number of analyses to understand. Just to show you some of the problem, and I'm hoping that you can see this well. Move this out of the way here. In a study that I'm doing in my own lab, we've looked at these mindfulness-based curricula, not just for the ethical underpinnings, but we've tried to start identifying some of the active ingredients. What is actually in these programs? And this chart here shows you in each of 12 programs, which are listed at the top, 15 different theoretical foundations that these programs have identified themselves in their material as what their program is based on. So social emotional learning is covered in 8 of the programs, 8 of the 12. Developmental theory, emotion theory is covered in 4 of 12. Movement, some of them incorporated yoga, neuroscience. So you can see there are many, many different theoretical foundations, and none of them are the same. There's no combination that's exactly the same across these programs, and some have covered a lot and some have only covered a few. We've also looked, as we've analyzed these programs to try to identify the active ingredients, to see what practices are being used and what mindfulness skills they're trying to cultivate. So the practices are the things that the participants are engaged in, and we borrowed John Kabat-Zinn's definition, where they are building on awareness that arises from paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. For the mindfulness skills, we based these skills on a theoretical framework proposed by Rob Roser, and we wanted to see which practices are building which skills. And here's our lists of codes. And a lot of these skills will probably look familiar to you. Things like emotion regulation, focused attention, emotion awareness, thought awareness. We looked at different kinds of perspective taking / empathy, from cognitive empathy to affective empathy, compassion, self-compassion. And I'm just going to give you a little tidbit here. What we found is programs are very different. For this, we looked at Learning to Breathe, Pure Edge, C-Learning. So a couple of things to point out to you. Focused attention was covered in a lot of all these curricula. Surprisingly, emotion regulation only covered in C-Learning. Now these, I should qualify, are mindfulness practices that relate to these skills. There may be emotion regulation being taught through something other than a mindfulness practice. So this table refers only to mindfulness practices that are building on these mindfulness skills. As you can see, Pure Edge has a lot on social connection. Surprisingly, very few of these curricula are actually building on empathy through mindfulness-based practices. Again, they may be building on empathy through different kinds of pedagogies, including activities, reflections. But in terms of students doing mindfulness-based practices, there are very few that are actually building empathy. I also want to show you an example about how practices sometimes cultivated different skills depending on the curricula. And I believe this is true too in mindfulness-based interventions for adults. So in this example, this is a gratitude practice, and in C-Learning, it's building on the skill of emotion awareness. And what I've given you is some of the directions that the teacher has for what to say to the students in the class. So if you focus on what's in red, that's where you'll see the emphasis on building emotion awareness. Again, it's a gratitude practice. Pure Edge also does a gratitude practice, but it's building on the skill of social connection, which is really highlighted in what's in red. So just because a practice is being used doesn't mean it's being used in the same way, depending on the intervention. Understanding this is important, and Stein and Vitkovitz really explain why. Moving towards empirical validation, they say, of hypothesized active ingredients of mindfulness is critical at this point in time, because as evidence for mindfulness-based programs has proliferated, so too have its growing pains. Quality of research and implementation of mindfulness-based programs has been inconsistent. That was in 2020. That actually leads us to our fourth challenge, which is one of facilitation. This is an aspect of implementation that is critical. So what does effective mindfulness facilitation actually look like? Now we have some folks, Rebecca Crane, Catherine Crane at Bangor University have developed over the course of the last 10, 12 years, the MBI TAC, which is used in clinical settings for mindfulness facilitators of adult programs. More recently, my colleague Trish Broderick and Mark Greenberg and Jenny Frank have worked on a similar system called the Timios, used in schools for classroom teachers working with children and adolescents. And what these seem to hinge on is not just what the teachers, the mindfulness facilitators do, but how they embody mindfulness. How do they bring mindfulness into that classroom, into that group setting? What does that look like? How does that get developed over time? And how can we measure it? And in 2018, Crane and colleagues really captured how difficult this is when they said it's difficult to describe what it looks, sounds, and feels like when teachers do the inner work of connecting mindfully to experience, and challenging to capture how this inner work is reflected in their verbal and nonverbal behavior. it's even more difficult to quantify it. So where does that leave us in terms of implementation? Facilitation is an important part of how we implement programs. And this chart here is some work in progress with a group of scholars who got together. And we said, we really need a better understanding of what's getting reported when we look at research. So this concept map comes from an article we've submitted where we're trying to understand what are the most important elements that need to be reported. And you'll notice the training of the facilitator is part of the implementation support system, part of the participants, and part of the quality of implementation. There are many other things included here. We also need to understand the context. Who's receiving the program? In what kind of a situation are they in? Especially if it's a school. What are the core components of the program? What kind of dosage is appropriate? How much of that dosage do our participants, especially our school children, but others as well, this applies to adults, what do they need to take up? How much do they need to actually be integrating into their everyday lives? What's feasible and acceptable in terms of the delivery and receipt of a program? So just a real quick example of a project that we did trying to understand how we develop facilitators, especially those who are not already trained in mindfulness, who don't necessarily have their own personal practice, who are not familiar with mindfulness to a great extent. In the Learning to Breathe program, we attempted to train classroom teachers who were in secondary schools. Learning to Breathe is a universal prevention program linked to health and health curricula and health standards. It's based on John Kabat-Zinn's MBSR. It includes mindfulness practices as well as some compassion practices, and it really emphasizes stress reduction and wellness. And I've listed a number of people who worked on this specific project. For this arm of the project, our goal was to examine how teachers experienced implementing a school-based mindfulness program over time, including their embodiment of mindfulness. We also wanted to understand the context and look at the supports and challenges that they experienced as they were learning to implement. And there are a couple of articles that have come out on this. I'll show you two quick slides showing our analysis. This goes back to the initial challenge of conceptualization. We asked these teachers over time, over the course of between 12 and 24 months, how they defined mindfulness. Their own definitions changed, and the definitions they used between each other tended to be quite different. This could impact how they implement the program. We also looked to see what kind of shifts did they have to make in their pedagogy, in their beliefs, what kinds of things that we identified in the Timaeus as being a part of effective implementation. What kinds of things did they have to shift in order to implement effectively? And one of the things that we found was the importance of personal practice was critical. So where does this leave us? We have a lot of challenges in terms of delivering our interventions, ensuring that we're doing this for the right reasons, and achieving the outcomes that we'd like to achieve. And as we do this research, what I would offer to you is we have an opportunity to make this research base as rigorous as we can. And I think the key is to use an implementation science framework in order to do that. The backbone of implementation science is understanding what works for whom and under what conditions. So what does that mean for mindfulness-based interventions? Well, I think it means, for one, and I'm borrowing some of these from Glasgow and Chambers. I think we need to either develop our own loose consensus of how we're conceptualizing mindfulness, and that will come with interdisciplinary conversations, or we need to make sure that we're being transparent when we develop a program or when we report on a program. In our research, we really need to adopt a diversity of research approaches. Randomized control trials are great at helping us to understand outcomes, but they're not great at helping us understand the complexity of the context within which those outcomes were gleaned. We need multiple measures, we need multiple methodologies, quantitative, qualitative, and we need people from different fields. Finally, we need to ensure that we're addressing issues of implementation and that we're adopting a systems level view of our interventions. If we want to scale up beyond exploratory studies, beyond RCTs, we need to adopt a translational science continuum where we're moving not just from development and efficacy, but towards effectiveness and implementation, because that's where we'll understand issues of context. And that's where we'll be able to better manage some of the challenges that we're currently facing. So with that, I will leave you. I think we need to keep in mind why we are doing what we're doing. It's mindfulness for the self as a start, and mindfulness in order to understand our interconnection with others. I look forward to hearing from you. I wish you well at the conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Deborah, for this very informative session. I think the picture shown by Dr. Deborah for conceptualization, the difference between an adult and a child looking at the same thing but having a very, very different visual and the thought process. Probably it is one of the most relatable definition we came across, definition for mindfulness that we came across in last 2 days. So let's have the child's visualization even when we are grown up. Okay, so with that, we are moving ahead with the most weighted segment of the evening, the Best Paper Awards. I would like to request Dr. Vinita Sahai, the Director IIM Bodh Gaya, Dr. Nidhi Mishra, and Dr. Tina Bharti, co-conveners of the conference, to present the awards. So the third position goes to paper title, Role of Gender in Mindfulness, a study of Indian B School students, author Komal Kumari, research scholar from IIM Bodh Gaya. The second position goes to the paper title, A Systematic Review of the Theoretical Background of Career Adaptability by Gitanjali Pursavani. And Nonu Mary Jose, both from Christ University, Bangalore. And the first position goes to paper title, Are Mindfulness and Self-Compassion Protective Factors Against COVID-19 Phobia? An Empirical Examination by Tapan Panda and Sachin Kumar. Mr. Sachin Kumar is from Manipal University, Jaipur, and Mr. Tapan Panda is from Nasimunji Institute of Management Studies, Hyderabad, India. Congratulations, everyone. So with this, we have come to the end of the session. I would like to request Dr. Tina Bharti, Professor, OBHR, Chairperson, Placement Committee, and the co-convener of IRCM to deliver the vote of thanks. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you, Professor Nanda. Respected keynote speaker, Richard Vadam, Scott Shute, Richard Fernandez, Lynn Walde, Amit Bernstein, Susan Abadian, Deborah, pre-conference workshop trainers, Laurie Schonbach, Ruchika Sikri, Lakshmi Menon Bhatia, Honorable Director and Patron, Dr. Vinita Sahai, my fellow convener, Dr. Nidhi Mishra, faculty colleagues, the entire IRCM team, enthusiastic participants, and Professor Nandana. Thank you so much. I feel extreme honor to extend a warm and a sincere thanks on behalf of IIM Bodh Gaya and IRCM 2022 for your gracious participation in the entire conference. The first International Research Conference on Mindfulness 2022 held at IIM Bodh Gaya was a precursor as well as a catalyst to serve the path of mindfulness. The overwhelming response received by the conference has emboldened our conviction to pursue the road of mindfulness. The conference received papers from 182 authors in the area of human resource, marketing, economics and general management, operations, and information technology. We are pleased to hold this conference in VUCA times, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. We experienced sharing of ideas on very pertinent topics in diverse areas revolving around the concept of mindfulness. The success of this conference has been dependent on the participants and the constant sharing of the ideas among them. I would also like to thank the Advisory Board of Samatvam, the Mindfulness Center of IIM Bodh Gaya, for providing the umbrella support to hold this conference. I would also like to thank the many faces behind the curtain that contributed in successfully organizing this conference. This conference helped in breaking the ice in terms of content across different sectors. Once again, thank you to all our trainers, keynote speakers, Madam Director Dr. Vinita Sahai, fellow colleagues and participants, along with the IT, admin, and IRCM team for making this conference a successful one. I would like to end this with a beautiful quote that it's not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter. With that thought in our mind, take care of yourself and your family till we meet again. Thank you so much.